Hello, everyone. It's been a while, but I'm finally back with another story from the archives of Pennsylvania history. This topic took a lot of research effort to get through more than a century of rumors, emotions, and the different versions told of the events. I've done my best to try and stick to the facts of the case. It is a true crime matter and deals with violence and other sensitive issues, so all of the warnings apply here. If you aren't interested in this type of story, I understand. If you do like historical content in general, especially local Pennsylvania deep dives, please don't forget to tickle the algorithm for me. Like, comment, you know the drill. With that out of the way, let us begin. On the early morning of January 3rd, 1900, despite the snow that had been falling all morning, a crowd of about 125 people gathered in the square of the Northumberland County Prison Yard. Its imposing stone walls not quite high enough to deter the other masses of people covering every nearby rooftop and vying for a look at the gallows inside. The prisoner appears, and the crowd would later comment how he walked with his back straight and no air of excitement. Some would state he seemed to have a spring in his step. As he stood upon the gallows, he waved and called out to nearby acquaintances, "Goodbye, boys. Take good care of yourselves." Dietrich, the warden, then asked if he had anything else to say, and the prisoner replied, "I am guilty of what I did, and I hope the Lord will forgive me. That's all." Moments later, the trap door dropped open. The hemp rope stretched, and the life of the young killer came to an end. But this is not your typical true crime story. In order to find out why, we have to explore and learn more. Before we talk about the crime, we need to look at the location. These back roads may be paved today, but the landscape hasn't changed much in the last 125 years. It's still mostly farms and homesteads trying to scratch out a living from wildly uneven terrain and unforgiving nature. A lot of the farms and families in this area trace their roots back to the founding of this county. Small communities where large farming families were connected to each other through webs of marriages. In today's fast-paced digital world, it may be hard to imagine the simple life of this area, but it's hard to resist its charming, babbling brooks, the commanding gaze of the mountains, and the whispered secrets of the wind through fields of grain. Despite the rapid growth of Sunbury and Northumberland County in general, and the relative closeness to the city, the topography kept this area very much in a world of its own. Small local shops, blacksmiths, and mills dotted the hillside. These small ridge and valley communities were their own microcosm, where everybody supported each other through work and community. Edward Cressinger was born here on February 20th, 1880, to Isaac and Sarah Cressinger. He appears to be the only child of this marriage. His mother would die of consumption when he was barely 2 years old, an illness she was already suffering from at the time of her marriage to Isaac. Isaac would remarry in 1884 to Pauline Lurch, the widow of Albert Kaiser. Pauline brought with her 5 children from the previous marriage, and together with Isaac they would have 3 more. Edward was known to most everyone as a slow and simple child. His father would testify at his trial that he had suffered a head injury when falling in a high chair at 2 years old. He also said that after the injury, he viewed Edward as weak. Family members testified about how he was shy around strangers and would avoid any that came to the house, and how he would fail simple chores if unsupervised, like overfeeding the pigs. Teachers testified about how he was behind children his age and preferred young children as companions over boys his own age. Locals testified the same, and matched the testimony of the family about how he was a good worker at some tasks, but was generally considered dim-witted, forgetful, and someone you had to holler at to get anything done. But there was another side of Edward, too. His stepsister testified of his quick temper and his cruelty to lesser animals. Locals testified of times that he had lied to them, and times that he had stolen women's underclothing. At the age of 15, in April of 1896, Edward served 30 days in jail for the assault of local girl Laura Holdren. He had attacked her and knocked her down when they had met on the road to the store. On the morning of October 10th, 1898, Edward went to the local store run by Miss Bonner shortly after 9 a.m. There he picked up some shot, powder, and firing caps for shotgun shells, and a new Barlow knife. He had some inquiry with Miss Bonner if she had any sharp knives. She told him she didn't know how sharp it was. After making his purchase, Edward walked home on the country mountain road. He had been in the store about 20 minutes. Henry Smith was dealing with a sick horse. That morning he sent his daughter, 16-year-old Daisy, to collect some sweet fern to treat the horse. Sweet fern is a small bush which has a history of being used medicinally and which grows in the area. Daisy left the house at about 10 a.m. and headed across the recently planted rye field. Her sister Minnie watched her head across the field toward the Cressinger house. It was the last time she would see Daisy alive. Edward returned home and grabbed his shotgun and 2 loaded shells, and called his dog to come with him as he walked toward the Smith's farm. He was intending to hunt some rabbits. The dog ran off and chased rabbits while Edward went into the shade of the trees. After a short while, he fired his shotgun into the air to call the dog. Daisy heard the shot and approached Edward. She yelled at him that he would be arrested for hunting rabbits out of season. He told her he wasn't hunting rabbits. The argument quickly got heated, and harsher words were exchanged. Daisy slapped Edward across his cheek and turned to leave him, headed toward her home. As she got about 30 feet away, Edward lowered his shotgun and shot her in the back. The shot was not fatal. Daisy quickly got back up and stumbled a few more feet. Edward tackled her to the ground, drew his new Barlow knife, and with one long stroke, slit her throat from ear to ear. Edward returned home and stashed the knife in an apple tree in his father's orchard. He put the gun in the barn and began cleaning up in a trough of water. Henry Smith, realizing that his daughter had not returned from fetching the sweet fern, went to look for her. While approaching the edge of the field, he found his young girl in a pool of blood. Other neighbors, having heard the shot and a girl's scream, had come to the property and began to gather. A search of the area began very quickly. A local farmer and justice of the peace named Morris Snyder and his son Harry went to the Cressinger property, where he found Edward washing blood off of his clothes. Edward claimed his clothes were bloody because he had fallen. Snyder told Edward that he needed to come with him to see Esquire Wren. Edward resisted. Morris asked if he had been out hunting rabbits, and Edward snapped, "Who told you that?" He stated he had not been hunting. His gun was found and inspected, and it appeared to have been freshly fired. Other men had come along or gathered at the property by this point, and Edward was taken into custody and evidence gathered. Jacob Grimm, a local county commissioner, had an idea. He had heard that the girl's throat had been cut, and had heard that Edward had bought a Barlow knife from the store that morning, and that a similar knife had been found on the property. He went to Miss Bonner's store and tried to get a Barlow knife, but she was out of stock. He asked where she got the knife, and she told him another shop in the city. So he went there and inquired about the knives Miss Bonner bought, and they had a few in stock, so Grimm borrowed one from the shopkeeper. He then went to the jail along with the county detective Miles Dougherty, where together they met with and questioned Edward. After some initial questioning, Grimm pulled out the knife and said, "Ed, I found your knife." He gave it to Edward, who looked it over and asked, "Where did you get it?" "Just where you put it," Grimm replied. Ed asked again and got the same response. On the third time asking, "Where did you get it?" Grimm replied, "Nobody knows better than you, because I found it where you put it." Edward replied, "Well, you must have found it in the apple tree by the wash basin." Grimm replied, "Certainly, you knew where you put it." He then looked Edward square in the eye and asked, "Why'd you do it, Ed?" At this point, Detective Dougherty asked, "Did you have a quarrel?" Edward replied, "Yes, she slapped me." At this, Dougherty raised himself up and says, "I don't want you to say another word unless it is voluntary, because anything you say we will use against you." They wrote down the confession and had Edward sign it. Daisy Smith was buried at the Mountain View Presbyterian Cemetery. A crowd of hundreds had come to pay respects to the young girl whose life had been cut so short. Her pure white coffin was brought up the hill to the church in a carriage procession. It was then brought inside the church, where a choir sung 4 hymns. A eulogy was given, and a 5th hymn was sung as the coffin was carried outside, and Daisy Smith was lowered to her final resting place. Her father and mother would be buried alongside her in the years after. The trial began Monday, February 6, 1899, with the opening of the midwinter session of the Quarter Sessions Court. At the prosecution table was District Attorney D.W. Shipman, with P.A. Mahone assisting, along with Coroner Schindel and County Detective Miles Dougherty. Edward was represented by Charles M. Clement and William H. M. Orem. Edward pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity and requested a jury trial. Given the spectacular nature of the case, the initial jury pool was quickly exhausted, and additional potential jurors had to be called in. The Northumberland County President Judge Clinton R. Savage presided. I'm not going to go into too much of the details of the case. The case presented by the prosecution is pretty well summed up in my previous account of the events. There was little question that Edward had committed the act. The defense argued that Edward was defective of mind and a sexual deviant. They had a hard case. They were pushing a diminished capacity defense before such a thing existed. Edward didn't fit the legal definition of insanity at the time, and this was an important distinction that weighed heavily throughout the case. I have gone over most of the defense's relevant facts in the previous accounting as well. The trial lasted from Wednesday into Saturday. On Saturday morning, both sides gave closing arguments, and the trial broke for lunch. On returning from lunch, Judge Savage gave his instructions to the jury. While I have not been able to uncover the transcript of the trial, the arguments the defense made over the jury instructions are well preserved and deserve our attention. Judge Savage's initial instructions to the jury instructed them to consider the options of first and second-degree murder, as well as manslaughter, and he provided some fairly decent instructions on how to pick between those options. The defense made 6 arguments for additional jury instructions, detailed here on the screen. The short and plain version is that they were arguing very hard to remove first degree from the options. They argued that if Edward wasn't legally insane, he was at least close enough to the definition that he couldn't have had a motive or the presence of mind to plan the act, both of which were required for a verdict of first degree. The jury retired to deliberate. It took them just an hour and 25 minutes. The verdict came back guilty of murder in the first degree. The defense immediately moved for a new trial. On Saturday, May 13, 1899, Edward Cressinger was brought once again before Judge Savage. In those days, the appeal in this trial was handled by the same judge, or in some cases, went straight to the Commonwealth Supreme Court. After telling the defendant to rise, Judge Savage read his verdict. Edward Cressinger, you have been convicted of the murder of Daisy Smith, the jury having found you guilty in the first degree. She never done you any harm. You met her in a lonely spot, while she was in a weak and helpless condition when compared with your manly strength, and the deed, which stands almost without parallel, was done without any provocation whatsoever. Nothing remains for the court but to carry out the law. The sentence of the court is that you be taken back to jail, and from there to the place of execution, where you shall hang by the neck until you are dead, and may the Lord have mercy on your soul. On September 15th, the governor signed the death warrant, setting the execution for November 18th. When it was announced that the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania was granting an appeal, there was an outburst of local anger. One local column from nearby Milton wrote, "Cressinger is a brute who had a fair, impartial trial, and if he don't stretch hemp, it will be because there is no justice in the Northumberland County Court. There have been within 15 years 72 killings in this county, and not a single hanging." October 13th, the case was brought before the Commonwealth Supreme Court. They denied overturning the verdict. Numerous technical arguments were dismissed, despite further testimony of expert witnesses who testified as to the feebleness of mind of the defendant, None of them would call him insane. There was a great deal of discussion about the trickery under which the confession was obtained. Of particular note, the precedent set in this case, in the lead opinion written by Justice Mitchell. The object of evidence is to get at the truth, and a trick which has no tendency to produce a confession, except one in accordance with the truth, is always admissible. Society and the criminal are at war, and capture by surprise or ambush or masked battery is as permissible in one case as in the other. This has been cited in numerous cases within the Commonwealth since to defend this type of practice by law enforcement. The last hope for Ed was the Board of Pardons. Cressinger's defense attorneys immediately wrote to the governor requesting a stay of the execution so that the case could be brought before them. The stay was granted and the date was pushed to December 5th. Delays of the board meeting resulted in a further stay granted December 1st, with the date of the execution now set for January 3rd, 1900. On December 21st, the Board of Pardons refused the request for an appeal. It should be noted that Cressinger's attorneys, Clement and Orem, defended Edward, including hiring expert witnesses and paying for travel expenses out of their own pockets. They truly believed, not in the innocence of their client exactly, but in the belief that he should have received a life sentence rather than a sentence of death. At the time, Edward was the youngest person ever sentenced to death in Pennsylvania. This was another point the defense brought up repeatedly. They were trying to convince everyone that this man was really a child. When his attorneys informed Edward of the Pardon Board's appeal denial, is the only time it is noted that the implications of what was going to happen to him appeared to have any effect on Edward. For a brief moment he was solemn. There are many notes that all through the trial and his time in prison, he seemed to be unaffected by the events, more invested in being the center of spectacle, waving at friends in the courtroom, being happy and cordial in the prison and willing to meet with reporters. But finally, for a brief moment, he seemed to understand what was going to happen. His father stood by his side throughout the trial, sat with him in the courtroom, testified on his behalf. When he didn't visit, the two wrote letters to each other. He visited with Edward in his final hours, but he refused to walk him to the gallows and elected to remain inside the prison walls. We know what Edward had for breakfast that morning. Multiple sources report he had a beefsteak with poached eggs and fried potatoes and onions served with coffee. Although he had generally refused spiritual counsel while in prison, and his stepmother testified that he generally skipped church to pick mulberries and make wine, Edward did allow a reverend to provide final counsel. When the appointed time came, Edward refused to be accompanied on the walk, choosing to walk on his own in front of the warden and reverend. He climbed the steps seemingly without much concern and stood in the position. As two men tied ropes around his legs and secured his arms, he called out to some acquaintances in the gathered crowd. Daisy's father Henry stood at the front of the crowd. He kept his eyes locked on Edward throughout the event. "Goodbye, boys. Take good care of yourselves," Edward said to his friends. Dietrich the warden asked if he had anything else to say. Cressinger replied, "I am guilty of what I did, and I hope the Lord will forgive me. That's all." Multiple accounts state that after the hood had been placed over his head and the noose around his neck, Edward yelled out one final, "Goodbye, everyone," just before the trap was strung. Accounts differ on most of the details of his death, but they do agree that his body was placed in a plain pine box and taken to the funeral home. Henry Smith was interviewed and was quoted as saying he was satisfied and that justice had been served. On the following Thursday, a service was held at the Cressinger family home. Hundreds of people were in attendance, most for the spectacle, but many of them were members of the community come to support the father who had lost his troubled son. After the ceremony, the oaken casket was opened, and the crowd was allowed to view the remains. On the lid of Edward's casket were inscribed the words, "At rest." The body was buried in his father's orchard. Steps were taken to prevent people disturbing the grave, as rumors of attempts to do so had already begun to spread before the sentence had even been carried out. The grave was dug extra deep, and other measures were taken to protect the site. Newspaper accounts a few days later describe Isaac patrolling the orchard at night with his rifle and threatening to shoot any ghoul who attempts to steal Edward's body. Other accounts describe family and friends keeping a 24-hour watch on the gravesite. In my exploration of this story, it's Isaac that I've come to care for the most. Even in the most sensational and scandalous accounts, it's clear that the father loved his troubled son. He felt a responsibility for Edward and tried to care for him in a time when there wasn't much help for people available like his son. He buried him in the orchard to keep him close and sought to protect and provide for him in death as he had tried to in life. In recounting the story in the 1930s, the Deputy Controller John D. Bucher said, "There is little doubt that in the present age, when there is more knowledge of mental illness than there was then, that Cressinger would not have been executed. His counsel made an eloquent address which fell on deaf ears. There are institutions now for those such as he." If there's one thing that I've learned, it's that history rarely leaves us with easy answers. Sometimes it simply leaves us with better questions.